Hi, everybody. We are back again. This is Rex Saldana,
Hey, and it's Mark Stevens.
and we have a podcast for you today talking about 1984 for the love of Big Brother, Eurythmics' critically acclaimed and fan favorite album from 1984, which served as the soundtrack to the film of the same name. But as the Eurythmics fans know, it's much more than just a film soundtrack. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about each track one by one, offer our thoughts and critiques. We'll address the two video clips as well. Although if you haven't listened to our podcast on the videos, we have a three-part podcast on all of the individual videos. So that's an interesting listen if you're so inclined. Then we'll talk a little bit about the great reviews that the album got, and also some clearly asinine reviews. And then, and then we'll talk about briefly about the controversy surrounding the soundtrack and the film. So we'll start with the first track on the album, and it's called "I Did It Just the Same." And Mark, I'll let you start. Thoughts, impressions?
I Did It Just the Same sets the tone for the whole album, I think. And really, it probably sets the tone for, in essence, what the novel was about, in the sense of, the main characters going against Big Brother, going against the government, falling in love, having their own thoughts. You weren't allowed to have your own thoughts. You couldn't do that. So it's, when I think back on it often, I think of that the 1984 album, you kind of think of it as a dark album. And so I sometimes think of all of it that way. But I Did It Just the Same isn't really dark. It's kind of uplifting. Uplifting may not be the right word, but
it's defiant and triumphant.
Yes, yeah, and it's a great start to the album. A lot of people say that's a favorite song from the album.
Yeah.
So it's you get a lot of Annie's vocal hijinks in that album on that song rather, and it's quite good.
It's interesting that the bleakness of the theme of 1984 and the oppression by the totalitarian government and all that the album starts out on a positive note. And,
well, it's a defiant note, isn't it?
Right, it's defiant.
Yeah,
and she's celebrating the fact that she did speak, she did fall in love, she did make love, she did have sex or whatever. She did it just the same, and she's triumphant. And I think the exuberant vocal acrobatics that she does in the song are, perfectly suited for that. And yes, I've always loved it. I've always thought it's a fantastic opening track. And I just have to briefly say that I had a friend at the time who knew I was really into Eurythmics, and I played that song for her, and I said, "Do you know who? Can you guess who this is?" And she said, "Aretha Franklin."
Really?
And I said, "No, Eurythmics." And she said, "Wow, you'll just buy anything by them, won't you?" So, clearly soundtracks are not everybody's bag, but I just thought that was very interesting. And that comment has stuck with me for the rest of my life. So
really, well, that's interesting that she initially said Aretha Franklin, and then she would say, "Well, you'll buy anything." So.
Well, I think and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the reviews, but I think it goes back to the thing of like, why isn't this people are like, why isn't this a proper album? Shouldn't she be singing? Shouldn't these be proper songs? So there is that, I guess, that thought when a big band, a successful band, puts out a soundtrack,
Yeah, and we'll get through that. We'll get into a lot of that throughout this, but yeah, it is proper songs when you really want to look at it. Not the traditional way, but it's very interesting. I always think the beginning of "I Did It Just the Same," that little note that you hear always reminded me. I always thought my mind would go to that it's a drop of water, but it's not. And when I listen back, it doesn't sound like that. But even when I hear it now, just that first little bit, I just get these drops of water. And what I see in my mind is this dank, bleak place, which again, the song is not like that, but it's leading you there because that is the world of 1984. So
yeah, I agree with you 100%, Mark. It does sound like water dripping. When you say like in a bleak, think about the video for the song "Sex Crime," which we're going to talk about next. where they're in that sort of like, well, it was filmed at Battersea Power Station, but it looks sort of like like it was some kind of bombed out ruin or something.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're talking about that kind of industrial sound of the water dripping and that's the kind of imagery I get, rusty, dark, water dripping, dank, wet, kind of all of that. But also, but definitely industrial. There's an industrial, sound to that. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. Before you mentioned that, I never really thought about it in those terms. I knew it sounded industrial. I got that imagery in my mind, but you have really hit it on the head. I think you're right. It sounds like like dripping water or a faucet.
Well, and I think that's what soundtracks are supposed to do. They have these images, and if you don't have the movie in front of you, I love to listen to soundtracks of all sorts. I do all the time and download a lot of soundtracks, and I don't have to be watching the movie to enjoy the music and get something different out of it sometimes too. That's just me.
Well, when I was a kid and before the advent of videotape, yes, folks, we're that old. Really, the only way you could bring a movie home was to buy the soundtrack.
Good point.
You couldn't own movies then. The only time you could see them would be in the theater or when they would show them on TV. So soundtracks were important to me. If I loved a movie, I bought the soundtrack. So I understand what you're saying. I mean, soundtracks were not alien to me. So when this one came along, it was kind of like, okay, great, and I embraced it. And as we've said, it's not completely a traditional soundtrack. It has some actual songs on it. The first being the next track, "Sex Crime," 1984, which everyone knows was a huge hit in Europe in Christmas time '84. Banned in the U.S., of course.
Well, from some radio stations. Some radio stations wouldn't play it, so it ended up. Remember back in the day, wasn't it that that the album had a sticker on it at some point? Was it the album that had a sticker banned by the Thought Police or some such thing?
Censored by the Thought Police. And I'm not sure if that was added after the controversy or initially on the initial pressings.
I think it was. I think it was added later, and just to sort of as this sort of commentary on the whole thing, which we can get to. But yeah, so but the lead single, and it was still a hit here in the dance clubs, and 12-inch single I think did really, really well. So what a great song.
I knew people that had the soundtrack that weren't even huge Eurythmics fans, and that really surprised me, because for an album that was kind of underground and not well promoted in the US, people had it and people liked it and people talked about it. I mean, I had a friend that specifically mentioned Sex Crime, and the whole reason he went out and bought it was because of that drum beat in it. He just loved the drum beat. And these were people that were just kind of casual Eurythmics fans. So I think that speaks to the power of that album and in that song.
Well, I had the same experience. I was in high school at the time, a teenager, and my close friends and I had the same sort of taste in music. So my very close friends and I liked Eurythmics and Culture Club and all the kind of big stuff at the time. But, the people on the peripheral side, and a lot of them really they didn't care anything about Sweet Dreams or Here Comes the Rain Again. It wasn't their cup of tea. But, man, a lot of these people love Sex Crime. They just did. It was, and it was kind of weird for me. Like, well, why do you like that? And you didn't really go crazy about the other stuff, but they did. And there was, I remember going to a record store. Do you remember back in the day? Yes, again, as Rex has pointed out, we wouldn't be doing this podcast if we weren't this old, probably. But back in the day, when you went to things called record stores, but this particular record store had sort of an upper level where there was a DJ, and he would play the latest songs. Basically, it was to get you to buy, the records. It wasn't a dance place. It was just, he was up on this level and he would play the latest singles. And he had the 12-inch single for Sex Crime, the extended mix of almost 8 minutes long. And he was playing it as loud as he could get it. And he was dancing down the sort of this upper level, clapping his hands, just joyful with this single. He adored it. I mean, I remember him coming up to me when I came in because he knew that I liked Eurythmics, and he had the 12-inch, and he's single, and he said, you're going to want this, And I thought he was an older guy. He was probably 30 years old, but when you're 15 or 14, 30 is probably old. It's not now. But
he's probably now over 70.
But that was if it hadn't had the problems with U.S. radio, that would have been a big hit. That would have been a huge hit, just like it in Europe and England and other places.
Yeah, but all the indicators were here that it was very well received by the public, by the people that heard it, and really, the reaction to it was like you said, yeah, people were just like crazy for it. Maybe because it was like Eurythmics' first, like really, like heavy dance number, or we'd had Right by Your Side, but I think the public perception was mostly that it was kind of melancholy and dark music, and this presaged Would I Lie to You, which of course broke them even wider into the areas of normalcy, if you will. So I think people were like, wow, this kind of rocks and is raucous, and it's percussive, and it's got the drums and all the vocals, and it was different from Here Comes the Rain Again and Sweet Dreams. And I think that maybe it's sort of a revelation to people. Like Would I Lie to You was an even further revelation.
It was very much a song that was in the Eurythmics vein of repetition and not a lot of words. When reviewers were kind of perplexed that a lot of the songs didn't have lyrics, Sex Crime actually has, other than maybe Double Plus Good, the fewest lyrics of the main lyrical compositions. Aren't really a lot of words to it, and it's a lot of repetition, as they have done up to that point and had after as well. But it was it caught you. You didn't stop listening to that song. It took you along with it, dancing, listening, the repetition, all of it brought you along.
Yes. Our friend Maureen, who we refer to a lot. So if you listen to our podcast, you'll hear us refer a lot to our dear departed friend Maureen Martin, who passed away in 2005. But she was a huge Eurythmics fan, friend to both of us. And she was convinced that, and I always thought this was interesting, she was convinced that one of the reasons that the song was not played on U.S. radio was, of course, because of the term sex crime. But she said the lyrics, cannot take this for granted with your eyes over me. Maureen said it could be easily heard as with your rise over me, which leads to images of rape, sexual abuse, things like that. So, and I never thought about that until she mentioned it, but when you listen to it, it can be heard that way too, So just an interesting thing that Maureen pointed out, and as we've said before.
I think if you're really not paying attention in your radio program, and we should mention that some radio programmers in the U.S. were playing this song, but there was some backlash, and a lot of them weren't playing it, and so it the single basically dissipated and went away in 2 or 3 weeks. But just think of all the. Maureen's probably right on that. Just think of all the songs over the years that all of us have misunderstood the lyrics, or in lots of ways. So if you don't have the writer of the song in front of you to explain this song to me. You don't have that, so you're making this decision, and Annie has said it in as late as 2018 in an interview with she and Dave for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The first time they were nominated, and Dave said something to the effect of, no, it wasn't. It was when the vinyl remasters were released, and they have this joint interview, and Dave says, he's saying, I don't even know what the problem with the song was, and she said something like, well, yes, you do, Dave. It was the title of the song. And I
remember that. Yeah.
I love the song. And I think you have to say, you don't write a song called Sex Crime and not think that's a little bit provocative. but the provocative and doing something the wrong way, they're two different things. Provocative does not have to have a negative connotation to it. But it was Orwell's Speak. The new Speak that he created for Orwell created for his book. So
it was intellectual and it went over everybody's heads, I think.
I think it did. I think it absolutely did. And not everybody, in the sense of, I think a lot of people who liked Eurythmics at the time, we were young. You were a little bit older than you're a little bit older than I am, but you were a student.
Just a little bit.
But you were a student. You were still in high school, right? Or just graduated?
I graduated in June '84. So when 1984 came out, it was between. Well, I had just started college, so
yeah. So great song. It's still, I think, one of the most popular songs. It was performed. It opened the Revenge Tour concerts, and it's a favorite for everybody. That's big.
One more thing I want to point out about the when Sex Crime was released, and this is another thing that Maureen told me that I think makes a lot of sense. But a lot going on in the country at that time. We were having a lot of the child molestations were going on in preschools. It was the big McMartin preschool thing in California at the same time. And she was convinced that climate aided in why it was also censored on U.S. radio. Also, what was going on in the 80s at that time, which wasn't, I think, widely known at the time, but now if you go read about it, it was a real thing. This thing called a satanic panic that was really going on in the 80s. Parents thought their children were being inducted into Satanism by preschools, teachers, schools. It's a real thing. They've made documentaries about it and all that. It sounds like kind of stupid when you say it, but it's true. It really did happen. And Maureen was convinced that part of the backlash was attributed to that. And I can kind of see that, I think. Well, especially in California, where the McMartin thing was so huge.
Well, the landscape is not as it is today, where there's, a million different places that you can get information. At the time, radio stations playing this, they didn't want their telephones ringing off the hook. Like, well, what is this about? And because, everyone's not going to listen to that. They're not going to just sit down and listen to it and decide, well, what does it mean? Oh, it's about that book. Oh, okay. Well, that's okay. So yeah, you can understand what was going on. So
yeah. Well, I don't know. I think it's the mark of a great band when their songs get questioned or even banned. And it wouldn't be the first time. It was encountered later with the King and Queen of America, but that's another story. Okay, so the next song, For the Love of Big Brother. This is a song that I think we all know was probably written prior to them recording the 1984 album, because it had been performed on the Touch Tour. Although it wasn't, nobody knew the name of it or anything.
Yeah, she never said the name of the song when they were performing it, and it was a new song, she'd say. So you're right. I do think it was possibly written before, not necessarily for, but repurposed. Not sure if we've ever heard that for sure. But and it was a little more up tempo in concert, and I think it was only a handful of times that they performed it, even then on the Touch Tour. But I love that. I love For the Love of Big Brother. It's such a great song, and it reminds me a little bit of This City Never Sleeps from the Sweet Dreams album, rather. That same. What do you think? Do you think so?
Yes, I kind of. It feels sort of like it could be a companion piece to This City Never Sleeps. Thematically, it's the same thing, kind of, loneliness, isolation, which of course fits in perfectly with the theme of the film and all that. So I can see why they maybe repurposed it or used it for the film. Very haunting. I think Stewart's guitar work on that song is amazing as well. I love that song,
and it's one of I like the lyrics from it. And it's interesting because you and I have talked about this before, but I believe the first stanza is, like a train passing in the distance, like a bird in flight, I hear you call. And even though there's no one, dark shadows move across the wall, which I just think is great. And I used to think that the second line was blackbird in flight, I hear you call. And it's interesting. I was looking up the lyrics this week, just online, like searching, lyrics to Eurythmics. And one of the lyric sites that, you can always pull up when you're looking for lyrics, and it has blackbird in flight, because that's what I always thought it was. But I also have the music folio for my piano, and it's like a bird in flight. So, yeah. And I'm almost certain she's saying in the song, like a bird in flight. What were we just saying about we all can't necessarily understand all the lyrics, but yeah. Either way, I think it's a great lyric. Like a bird in flight, I hear you call. I just think that's such a great song. I mean, great lyrics to that song. Great.
Yeah, well, it is in what people hear. And I always heard it as like a bird in flight, but when you say blackbird in flight, I mean, it sounds like that too. So yeah. That's completely, a legitimate thing that somebody might think that. And like you said, either way, it's great. It works. I think if it's blackbird in flight or like a bird in flight, it still works wonderfully either way. Mm-hmm. I would even say maybe blackbird works a little bit better because it's blackbird, like the dark theme,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what I always thought, but it's interesting. So people weigh in on that. Is it blackbird in flight? Is it like a bird in flight? Well, if we have Annie on sometime, we'll ask her. But the lyrics are great. It's a great melancholy song. Got really reviews for it. Really, a lot of people picked up on that song and really liked it. I remember there was a review from the Washington Post. And he says it's the best cut on the album. It's a really great review, and he calls it a moody ballad, which features Lennox singing mournfully of the elusiveness of love against a rumbling beat. He says too, it would be a great song on any album, and I thought that was quite a great review for that song. And it was never a single. And I think there probably was maybe some thought process that it could be a single. It was one of the three main lyric songs, if you don't count Double Plus Good, which we'll get to. But I love that song. I adore it.
Me too. And I've grown to love it even more over the decades that have passed since it came out. Okay, the next song, Winston's Diary. Okay, well, we were talking about how people hear lyrics in different ways. Well, people can also, I think, take the theme of something in a different way. Now, we know what the theme of 1984 is, but for some reason, this short little instrumental song, for me, always conjured up imagery of like the American West, cowboys, the desert. It sounds like something a cowboy would play on his harmonica around a campfire at the end of the night, except it's all electronic. So it gets upended in that way. So I've always just felt that about it. And this may be kind of funny to some listeners, but it was always a dream of mine to play that song as I drove through the desert. What desert? Any desert. And I finally did that a number of years back. I was driving through the Mojave Desert alone, and I played the song, and yeah, it was sort of I played it like 3 times, and it was sort of a little personal triumph for me. It was like something I'd always wanted to do. And, but I think it goes back to that whole thing about the way people interpret things. Clearly it was meant, I think, as kind of just a little musical interlude in the film, or, some kind of, it was ambient music. But it's almost like Eurythmics goes country.
It's really short. It's really short. Isn't it? It's a very short track. So
it's one of my favorites. It's one of my favorites.
I was going to ask you how many times you played it while you were driving.
Well, it's so short, so I think I played it like 3 times. Yeah.
Well, what it reminds me of, and I know you're a fan, so it'll be interesting to get your take on this. The music of that track, Winston's Diary, reminds me very, very much of the music from Twin Peaks, especially the music from Twin Peaks: The Return. And there are desert scenes in that, but I mean, it's something I think Angelo Badalamenti I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. You can correct me if I'm not, but it reminds me so much of his music. 12, 15 years before Twin Peaks, or one time before Twin Peaks.
For the listeners out there, Mark and I are big Twin Peaks fans of the original series and the return series that came out a couple of years ago. I think when they announced they were actually doing a return, I was like jumping up and down like in my house and screaming and hollering for joy, because I never thought I would see that. I mean, what, 30 years later,
Yeah. But don't you think that music is very similar to the very emotive music that Angelo created for Twin Peaks?
Yes.
It reminds me so much of it. And I could see it. You could turn on a scene from Twin Peaks, turn the sound down, put Winston's Diary on, fit perfectly.
Yeah. Yeah. There were those scenes in the new series. A lot of bizarre things going on in the desert.
Episode 8, I think.
Yeah, I need to rewatch that series. It was so good, but so complex.
Yeah, be careful, people. We'll do a podcast on Twin Peaks next. Be careful. Yeah, we have similar tastes, but anyway, I think it could fit very well in that. I love that idea of you, that it conjured up such a scene for you, though, that it was a desert scene. Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of music, that we all get something different out of music, totally different things, maybe.
Right. It's almost magical the way musical sounds can produce these pictures in your mind, or these these ambient feelings or sounds, and it's always been like that with me. When I listen to music, it's very visual in my head. I see colors, I see images. And that's why I think I like Eurythmics videos so much, because they follow that same kind of same kind of idea. I'm not saying that my thoughts match what came out in Eurythmics videos, but it was that same kind of thing. Putting music to visuals in a way that aligns with the music, aligns with your thoughts and emotions. Does that make sense? Am I just kind of rambling now?
No, it does. And I think that, again, I just think that's, the power of music, and it's the power of this music that you and I both have liked for so long, and why we've liked it for so long. And it's great music. So
yeah, I think Dave and Annie are understand that what they created in the space of those 10 years has had a profound effect on their fans and on listeners, much more than they realize. I mean, look, we're still talking about it 40-something years later. There's still interest. The fans are still out there. They're hanging on every detail of what goes on, whether it's nothing or something, And we've got the fan websites that do well. I mean, yeah, for a band that some might call defunct, they certainly haven't gone away from the public consciousness, I think. And I think it's getting even more now. I mean, I'm really bowled over by this rock and roll fan vote. I mean, it wasn't like this last time. I mean, there seems to be so much more momentum this time, and a recognition of them as like, wow, look what they did. It could be that the remasters that have been out for several years have helped. We know that appeals to younger listeners. I will say this: the statistics for my website show a lot of people in the 25 to 35 age range clicking on things. So the younger people, yeah, and people our age, the stats are a little bit more down. The stats are higher for the younger people. So are they discovering? Are they? I don't know, but I think it's a positive thing.
Well, I've noticed that in recent times that you'll read the comments on YouTube, on a video on YouTube or anything like that that's connected to Eurythmics, and you're really getting a lot of respect, a lot of people discovering them and keeping them in really high regard. And again, this is an act that's been around for 40 plus years, so pretty good.
And that recent article about calling it the genre fluid music that was ahead of its time, it was ahead of its time, and so many artists today do this now. They jump back and forth between styles, and you don't think anything of it. But what I think younger people might want to realize is, years and years ago when we were young, to be genre fluid wasn't necessarily considered a good thing. People liked everything to be the same, especially radio programmers and record executives. And for an artist to be that kind of varied was unusual. And I think a lot of critics didn't even know how to receive that kind of thing back in the day. It's kind of, what are they doing? Can't they be more focused? To me, it was like, this is natural. Why wouldn't you want to experiment and do all sorts of different things and push envelopes and not do the same boring, hackneyed thing over and over?
Well, we would not be talking, this podcast would not exist. We would not be talking about them 40 years later had they not done exactly that. Had they not been fluid in the music that they made. It's what kept them going and moving on, and other people discovering them.
Yeah. It's almost like they provided a blueprint for a lot of what you see today, all this hopping around and different styles, and people don't think anything of it. They just accept it now. Back in the day, it was met with a little bit of resistance. Like I pointed out earlier with my friend's comment, you'll buy anything by this band. It's like, yeah, you're damn right I will,
That's right. Well, let's move on with 1984. So what's the next song? Greetings from a Dead Man, is that right?
Greetings from a Dead Man. Talk about that, Mark. You start talking.
Go ahead. You start.
Well, it's haunting. It's a little creepy sounding. It's one of those songs on the album that, for me, it just conjures up a lot of images in my mind. I think it's supposed to be referring to Winston's imminent demise, or the fact that he may possibly be killed. I know he's apprehended in the film. I could be wrong about that. I have to say I haven't watched the film in a number of years, although I listen to the soundtrack all the time. But yeah, so what do you think?
There's a great scene in the movie with Winston, and he's got his diary. He pulls it out of a block, and he's writing in it, and he uses those words, but it's kind of reversed, I think. From a man, I think, yes, this is what he says. From a man, greetings from a man, a dead, or something, dead man. He flips, it's flipped, so that the title is not the same, but again, them taking things from the book or from the movie, depending on it, or the same. But it's probably where you first really get a sense that this is a different kind of album, that there are going to be a lot of tracks in addition to the opening. I Did It Just the Same, that you're going to have a lot of music, but it's going to be Annie Lennox doing vocalizations, not necessarily lyrics, almost scat singing, really well done. And so, it's so different, but her voice is basically an instrument, if not multiple instruments, throughout some of these songs. And Greetings from a Dead Man is very much so that exactly. They're layering a lot of music, but also with her vocals. And I think that's really daring. I think you've got to have a lot of self-confidence that you're going to do that. And they did have a lot of confidence. Thank goodness. They should have. They were are very talented, but you have to have a lot of confidence to do that. And I think it showed.
Yes, you're right about that. And listeners sometimes don't respond well to those kind of vocal experimental things, like she does in that song. And she did some other things. She's done some other things in her career too, vocally, that I know fans have been kind of like, what? Like, one thing that sticks out for me is in the song Womankind from Songs of Mass Destruction. She does that, that kind of,
yeah.
And I remember some fans saying, what the heck is that? Why does she have to do that? That just sounds so weird and strange. And I thought, what? I think it sounds great. I love the fact that she did that. I love those kind of like vocal interpretations and stylings and experimentations. It just adds to the whole thing.
Well, you get that in the lead single in Sex Crime. The backing vocal basically are these vocal hijinks that she's doing all the way through. It takes you all the way through.
Mhm.
And, and you're right. She does that in lots of things. It was written by someone else, but no more I love yous, vocal hijinks. This is what she does. She does it so well. She played an air harmonica on the Grammys a few years ago with Hozier, and people went wild over that. They went wild over that.
Yeah, that was electrifying. That was an electrifying moment on the Grammys. I would say that was akin to when she came out in male drag back in 1983. That was electrifying too. Mm-hmm. She seems to do these electrifying things on the Grammys. So,
well, yeah, got to do something different, I think, is her idea. Right. But I do think it's vocal hijinks, if you will, and I think she just does it.
You could almost say that "Greetings from a Dead Man" is kind of the first song. I mean, when I say you can almost say it, it's kind of the first song on the album that isn't like, I don't want to say a proper song, but think about my train of thought. I Did It Just the Same doesn't have lyrics, but it has her scatting vocals and all that stuff, and it's listenable, danceable, and then you have Sex Crime, which is a real song, for the Love of Big Brother, which is a real song. Winston's Diary is so short, it's like an interlude. So this is almost kind of like the first song on the album where it's like you're confronted with, okay, this is really a soundtrack. Mm-hmm. But like you said, her vocals lift it above that and make it a more interesting listening experience. And
I can see why, it's different than the soundtrack or the score but there's some of that in the score. You still get some of Annie, her vocalizations in that. But it's different from a soundtrack. So I do think this album is as a whole was more inspired by, from
music derived from. It's more of a stylized type of soundtrack. It's almost like a soundtrack taken to an more artistic level.
Well, they didn't do this back in the day, but I could imagine if this was released today, that you might have this album from the group that created it as 1994 For the Love of Big Brother, and then you'd have a second album that was just the score itself. You could see that being done, and that's done a lot of times. That there are two of them. Wouldn't have been done back in the day, but
yes, that is the big thing now, right? 2 discs or two. One is like the either the songs from the movie or the more commercial soundtrack, and then the other one may be just the music or someone else's contribution or something like that. But you're right, that is done a lot these days. Hey, maybe. Well, I don't think we'll ever see something like that with 1984 because of the controversy and all that, which we'll address at the end. But I could be wrong.
I'd love to. I remember now that scene with Winston, and he simply says, "From a dead man, greetings." That he says it, you hear it out loud, but he's with his diary, and so I love that scene too. I just love all that, and it conjures up so much in just a few words.
Right. Okay, so now the next track on the album is Julia, which was released as a single, and of course is about the protagonist in the film, Julia, and she's the one that has the relationship with Winston, and they break all the rules, and the song is basically a lament, I think, about unrequited love or lost love. The lyrics, I think, are just amazing on this song, and of course it contains, I think, one of Dave Stewart's best guitar solos ever at the end of the song. But I remember the first time hearing this song just being bowled away by the lyrics. My favorite one is "When spring rejoices down the lane and everything is new again," and you have that piano in the background that sounds like somebody running or skipping, rejoicing down the lane, and it's just brilliant. And icy breezes chill the air, freezing snow lies everywhere. It's just gorgeous. It sort of reminds me a little bit of the imagery in her song "Cold," which would come, a little less than 10 years later. But cold is the color of crystal and things like that. And it's just
nobody warms music with icy cold lyrics as much as Annie Lennox. Nobody. It's these lyrics that are cold and burr, but she warms them up.
Right.
If that makes sense.
I mean, she's talking about icy breezes chilling the air, but yet you feel warm when you're hearing this. You don't feel cold. And I think that was the whole thing about them, right? In the beginning was that combination of the cold and the soulful.
It's a very layered song. So you've got the title, and the character, the name, Julia, repeating with the lyrics, the main lyrics juxtapositioned with it, Julia, and no one wants to hear me sing, but and that's again that very Eurythmics sort of the way they would do things. There was a lot of repetition, but it came with the lyrics, and it would push through, and it would over and over and over. And it was, I just think it's a great song. I wish they had performed it live. They never performed it live. And it's such a great loss. And I think too, moving on, it wasn't a big hit. I think it got to 44 in England. I don't think it was a hit anywhere that I'm aware of. It was released here in the U.S. Funny, on the B side was a special radio edit of Sex Crime, and they took off the sex at the beginning of it, and just starts out with crime. So it was kind of another, probably wasn't the wisest thing to do. With here, let's issue this to radio, same radio programmers who wouldn't play it, and we'll stick this on the back, kind of a little nudge, like, oh yeah, you wouldn't play it, but Julia was.
They were throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick with that.
Yeah, but it's a beautiful song. It should have been on the Ultimate Collection. I will say that. Well, none of them. I think there was probably issues with that, but well, it was a B-side on one of the singles from that, I think. But anyway, from the Ultimate Collection. But I think it's one of their best songs they ever did. Absolutely, there is no doubt that Julia.
And she's clearly singing it from, I think, Winston's point of view, as if I think he's singing, to her, right, Julia. He's speaking to her. So here you have Annie singing, from a male point of view, which back in the day that often had problems too. I remember Debbie Harry, in Blondie, would sing songs from a man's point of view or to a woman. And a lot of people would be put off by that. Like there was that song Pretty Baby, the Blondie did, and things like that. And even Jennifer, Eurythmics' Jennifer, where she's singing to a woman or singing about herself. That kind of thing was a little controversial back then. Singing from another gender's point of view. I don't think that's a big thing anymore, but I just think it's worth mentioning because that was a little unusual back then.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, like, you on first glance you may think she's singing to Julia, but she's not. This is Winston saying to Julia, "Will we be there? Will we still be there?" Yes, that is the point. You have to take music on a higher level than sometimes pop music wants you to do. Although, not disparaging pop music, that's what I listen to. That's what I've grown up listening to, what I still listen to. But I mean, in this little pop music package, there's a lot you need to pay attention to. It is. But that's a very good point. I think that's a very good point.
Yeah. All right, so the next track is Double Plus Good, and this is one of my absolute all-time favorite Eurythmics songs. I just think it's a stunning track in every way, the vocals, the instrumentation. And I will have to point out that on the remastered red vinyl, it sounds, I've never heard it. I mean, well, first of all, I've never heard 1980, the whole album sound as good as it does on the remastered vinyl. But that song in particular, when I listened to it on the remastered vinyl, I heard things I had not heard before.
Yeah, me too. And
it was like, wow, it was like listening to a whole new song. it's a great little. It's a song, clearly a song, meant to address the whole double speak of the this Orwellian society that was in the novel and in the film. But it's just it's so good. It almost reminds me of something like you'd hear on Savage,
Well, it starts out with those great African drums and these beats,
and those those little grunts, vocal grunts in the background. Hi. And then the drums are going, and it sounds very primal. Yeah,
it does. I mean, and I love that. All of it is taken directly from the book. Direct lines from the book, and it's nonsense. It's the nonsense that was spoken that had to the masses in the book, and it didn't matter what they were being told. It was irrelevant. They were being put in their place, and they had to live the life that they were supposed to live, and it didn't matter what it was. That was the beauty of it. And I love what Chocolate Rectified. It's nonsense, but it's great nonsense.
Yeah, I know. I love the part about Chocolate Rectify, and then of course I love the our forces in South India have won a glorious victory. The action we are now reporting may well bring the war within measurable distance of its end. Okay. And that sounds like anything you've ever heard out of any politician's mouth during wartime, basically a big bunch of nothing, which is what doublespeak is. But it's such a great song. I mean, even if you take away the theme of the song, just sonically, it's such a banger, and it's amazing. It's amazing. One of my all-time, you're saying Julia is one of their all-time best songs, and I agree with that. I think Double Plus Good, ranks up there with the best they've ever done.
I would think a lot of fans would agree. It's just it's a great song. You can't stop listening to it. And I love
and the counting. I think we mentioned that this is not the first time. Eurythmics have done counting in their songs. We had it in She's Invisible Now on In the Garden.
Yeah, she's a calculator.
13, 12, 11. And then we have it in this, 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 3. She never does get to 1. Have you noticed that?
That's the point. That's the great point. Right. The beauty of it, it's counting down over and over, and it starts over. It doesn't get all the way down. Start 10, 10, 10, 9, 8. And it gets to 2. It never finishes. And it's
like it's like doing 99 bottles of beer on the wall and never getting to 1 bottle of beer, But it's great. And then I want to point out we also have counting in Savage in is it you with your brand new hair 1, you 2, and then I don't think you hear the 3, but you hear like the hump for the 3. And so, it's an avant-garde kind of thing, and they've done it on several tracks. And
math teachers should have loved Eurythmics. They should have.
And I love things like that. I love counting and clapping and percussion and all sorts of things that just add to a song. Lady Gaga is really good at those kind of things too in her songs. And I look at that with awe when I look at songwriters. I think, how can you come up with something so brilliant yet so simple? It doesn't occur to me, but there they are doing they're counting or they're clapping and it works, and it gives me a chill down my spine, and I love it. And again, the power of music.
You mentioned the red vinyl, the remaster. We should probably mention something specifically about that. That was it 2018, that Record Store Day, and that this album, 1984, For the Love of Big Brother, had its first re-release in all this time on beautiful red vinyl, remastered. You could buy the vinyl album, and it also had a download for his that you could download. And it sounds so good. It sounds great. So if you don't have that, you can still find it on eBay and all that kind of thing. You should definitely get it because it hasn't had another release. And I don't think you can get you can't download the album from iTunes. It's never had this album for download, I don't think so. But the remaster is incredible.
Yeah, all the remasters came with download links, and of course, you can either download them as MP3 or WAV files. The WAV files are the better quality, and they just sound amazing. I transferred all, I made my own CDs out of all the albums, so it's sort of like I have a CD. And I also put the WAV files on my iPod, but the vinyl sounds great. And we should add that the artwork was a little bit spruced up and redone by Lawrence Stevens, who wasn't the original designer of the album because it was Virgin Records, but he took this reissue and added his own stamp to it. I think improved it a little. Some fans might not even see the difference, but in the logo on the album we have the star, the red star, which was not present on the original pressing from the other designer. So Lawrence added his own stuff and I think improved it, and even the logo is different. The Eurythmics logo itself is different.
Yeah, and you could read about some of that on Rex's website, Video Visionaries, where we interviewed Lawrence, I don't know, a couple of years ago. And we talked to him a lot about because he did most of the designs for Eurythmics albums and singles over the years, most of them not 1984, until he had a chance to do some tweaks to it for this remastered and re-release. And so you can go to Rex's website and read more about Lawrence Stevens.
That's videovisionaries.com. But we hope to have Lawrence on a future podcast to talk about his designs post Eurythmics for Annie and Dave's solo careers. So that's going to be an upcoming podcast. Okay. 2 more songs on the album. The next one is Ministry of Love. These last 2 songs are very atmospheric. Well, the whole thing is atmospheric, but these songs are especially atmospheric and dark and sinister and creepy. And of course, this is mirroring what's going on in the film as the film is reaching its climax and all that. But I have to say, the first time I heard Ministry of Love, it scared me. Literally, I mean, I was listening to it with headphones, and I got scared. And I love that. I love that. I love that I got scared. Thank you, Dave and Annie.
Aren't you a fan of horror films?
Oh, I love horror films. Yeah, I know. I know Annie has mentioned that she likes horror films as well.
So you like being scared. Okay.
Just really briefly on horror films, they're often derided by critics as being like lowbrow art. And I suppose that they could be considered that. I had an English teacher in high school who just absolutely thought Edgar Allan Poe was just trash. Because of the theme, because it was about dark and horror and all that. But I don't know. Horror films in the 70s horror films from the 70s are my favorite, and they were sort of the precursor to the big indie film movement that followed in the 80s and 90s. So just a little bit on that. But yes, I'm a horror film fan.
Right. So you like being scared, but Ministry of Love is, you're right. It's the climax of the film and the book, the whole gamut. It's all happening in the Ministry of Love, and it's not about love. And again, but if you're talking about the hijinks in her vocals, it's getting very, almost animal sounds and the whole kind of thing. And there's actually a really great extended version or remix on the B side of the Julia 12-inch single that you can find an extended mix of this track. And it really gets into the grunts and the animal sounds and it seems like monkeys or whatever it is, that she's doing really well.
I would venture to say that Annie was probably influenced a little bit by Yoko Ono's Primal Screaming and those kind of songs that she did on her work with the Plastic Ono Band and also as a solo artist. I'm a Yoko Ono fan. I'm very familiar with her work, and I hear that. I hear that in 1984. I hear that kind of homage to Yoko's vocal shrieking and her sounds, which I think a lot of people didn't understand it when it was happening. She's much more respected these days. They say alternative music couldn't have happened without her, and I agree with that. But anyhow, I'm going off on a different subject.
That's all right.
So yeah, I think that's something that I think Annie was aware of when she was doing those vocals. There's even some vocals I think on "In the Garden" that are similar to that. Even in something as recent as God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen with those ulations that she does in the background.
Mm.
Woo!
Yeah.
That's well, a ulation is a thing,
Mm.
in I think Middle Eastern culture, but it also reminds me of Yoko Ono. So there you go.
Well, it leads right to Ministry of Love, leads right into Room 101. Again, you can put this out on your porch when the trick-or-treaters are coming for Halloween, and it fits in perfectly because it's spooky, it's scary. It's supposed to be. Room 101 is about the torture chamber that, Winston, they're putting a cage on his face, and it's the worst thing. And that's the lyric that repeats over and over. It's the worst thing in the world. And I don't know if that's Dave, because it's a very deep, kind of slowed down. It's the worst thing in the world. I don't know if that's Annie all slowed down.
I think it is Dave, and it reminds me a little bit of some of the other vocal things you hear from Dave, like especially on, what is it, Aqua? Don't touch me. Someone once told me that they never heard that in the song until I mentioned it. I said, you never heard Dave saying, don't touch me.
Really?
And they said, no. And I had to go back, and it's like, I don't know how you can not hear that, but whatever.
No, but I could see people maybe just think that's, again, sort of music, but that is interesting. But yeah, I always wondered if it's the worst thing in the world is from Dave or Annie, but you're probably.
I always thought it was Dave because it would seem like it would go along with it being Annie's voice on the double plus good, speaking all the double speak.
Yeah.
It could be Richard Burton's voice slowed down. I don't know.
Well, maybe so. I don't know. Hadn't thought of that. But Room 101 ends really just with a crash. I mean, just a complete Room 101 and boom, and it's done. And the album's done.
Right.
That's it.
Well, the song is scary, and then it ends in a scary way. I mean, I remember thinking, okay, I'm feeling agitated and scared during the song, even though I like that. And then at the end, you're right. There's this big crash, and it's even more jarring. And like you said, it's the end of the album, and just brilliant.
I've read on one of the Facebook pages, Eurythmics Facebook pages, that recently where someone had been a fan, but they'd never had this full album, and they only got it recently, and that's fascinating to me. That should have had them all. Should have found who that was. I actually don't remember their name, or I would say it. I don't remember, but that never heard this album until recently. So people are still discovering this album. We're sitting here talking about the whole album, but we know for a fact, because this just happened really in the last few weeks, where someone mentioned that they had just bought the album and were going to listen to it for the first time, which I think is fascinating. And Ross Larkin from Australia, who is a huge Eurythmics fan, a lot of people know him. He's an actor and a musician. And he says this is his favorite album of all time, not just a favorite Eurythmics album, his favorite album of all time. And it does conjure up a lot of love from a lot of people because it is so different. It is so mystical almost. It takes you somewhere else. And it is dark sometimes, but I think you've talked about this before. It's a cathartic thing for a lot of people that, that we gravitate sometimes to dark things. It sort of helps us in our everyday life to go.
You mentioned earlier that I like to be scared. Well, when I was a child and I was at a horror film in the theater, and I would have to say thank you to my father for taking me to horror films. Most parents wouldn't take. I mean, I was being taken to R-rated horror films that I wanted to see when I was like 12. So thanks, Dad. I really appreciate that. Anyhow, that feeling of being so scared in the theater that you wanted to cover your eyes and hide under the seat, I love that feeling. And I try, and the older you get, the less that feeling is. I can't watch a horror movie anymore and get that reaction because I'm an older adult now. So, but every now and then when a horror film comes along that does do that to me, it's like, wow, it can still happen. And that's the kind of way it's similar for 1984. It's that same kind of cathartic feeling. You're scared as hell, but you want to go back for more,
Yeah.
Because it is cathartic.
Yeah. But so there's our take on the album. And I just, if you're listening to this and we post, these things on social media, let us know what you think. That's what this is all about. It's not just, the two of us talking about. We want to know what other people thinking about what your favorite songs are and stuff. But
yeah, we had somebody put a nice review from Australia where they actually disagreed with some of our points, and that was great. We love that. It was like, yes, that's what we want to hear. We want to hear your take. We want to hear your idea, because art is fluid and everybody has a different take on it.
Yeah, well, they were complimentary, but they also said, well, but I think,
completely complimentary, and their ideas that were different were very much welcomed by us, and that's what we want. We want that kind of dialogue.
I want to mention too that if you want to hear more about the score of the film, that there was a couple of DVDs released in the last few years, at least one, or Blu-ray, that you can separate the scores. Because if we explain this, the controversy, there were two controversies, one about the single, and then in England, a controversy where the producer and the director of the film had hired their own Dominic, what was his name? Muldowney, to do the score, but Virgin Films had hired Eurythmics and had paid them £600,000 apparently, which the director and the producer said was more than all of the actors and the film's producers and directors had received. But Eurythmics had been paid £600,000 to do this. Good stuff. But
you have a quote. You have a quote from Annie that she gave to the LA Times. Do you want to read that really quick? I think it's a good quote that kind of sums up where Eurythmics were coming from at the time.
Well, there was the controversy, and the producer Simon Perry and the director Michael Radford, they didn't like the music, and they were being very derogative about it, and it really sort of acted like it was being forced upon them. And that, I think, is where Dave and Annie said, no, back up a minute. And so there's a quote from Annie in the LA Times, the Los Angeles Times, on December 16th, 1984. And she says, quote, "We had no intentions of displacing anyone. Both the producer and director knew we had been invited to do the soundtrack. I quite distinctly recall that the director saying Muldowney had only written an opening theme. They never said he had written an entire score." And so there was a lot of controversy about that. And eventually the movie had music from both Eurythmics and Muldowney in it. Then in a few weeks, it was all Eurythmics. But you can get these DVDs that were released, or Blu-ray that were released in recent years, that you can listen to both. You can pick which soundtrack you want to listen. And if you go on YouTube, and I encourage you to do this, you can go on YouTube, and someone has put up, I think it was in 2017, the whole Eurythmics score. And it's absolutely beautiful. And it's derived from a lot of the songs from Julia is used, The Ministry of Love, I Did It Just the Same, For the Love of Big Brother, and Room 101. That is, there are elements from those Eurythmics songs that Dave and Annie did for the score. So you hear bits and pieces. They're beautiful pieces of the piano that you hear in Julia, and you hear that a lot in the score. So look that up on YouTube. Get the DVD if you can, because you can expand this album to what in essence was the score. And I do think that's the difference in 1984 for The Love of Big Brother was a Eurythmics album, inspired by, derived from, however you want to put it, from the work that they did for the movie. But there are two things. There's the score that they did, which is even stranger and more melodic's not the word, but what would it be, Rex? It's it's moody, much more moody, even so than this. They're all worth checking out. And to your point that you said earlier, I hope that it would be great one day if we could get that released as a bonus extended. People would love that. Go on YouTube and see any video about Eurythmics music from 1984, specifically this score. Hundreds of comments of people basically saying this is the best soundtrack that was ever made, and how much that they have loved it all these years. It's a very popular album from something that a lot of people wouldn't at the time would have not thought, because it had so much controversy on both sides of the Atlantic on two different things. A controversy with the filmmakers, then on the other side, controversy with radio programmers. It's a very popular album.
But in the end, the sheer artistry of the album and of the film itself transcended all the controversy. And nowadays, the controversy is almost a second thought, and people think more about the music. We should point out that Annie revealed a number of years ago that she had recently run into the director of the film, hadn't seen him since back in the day, and he apologized to her for, I guess, the way they were treated and all that. And I think she said something like, well, yes, you should apologize. So it looks like that hatchet has been buried. And like I said, art triumphed over controversy anyways. I mean, now it's regarded as a classic album in their canon. The movie is highly regarded. The soundtrack is highly regarded. So, well,
the producer once was quoted in an article from Kathy Booth with the United Press International, and it was part of the controversy, and he said he was worried about what soundtrack was going to be archived with this music, and what soundtrack would be used when it went to, quote, videotape. Shows you the age. And he said, and this is a quote from him, I think it's worth repeating because it makes it really strong today. He's worried about the TV distribution and the archives. Quote, in 6 months' time, when people forget how to spell Eurythmics. And I have to say, I've not heard of Simon Perry in a very long time, but Eurythmics have been around for a very long time, went on to win more awards than, anybody could ever count. Annie Lennox became, is the queen of British pop. So, didn't quite work out the way he thought it would.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's a good way to end this podcast. It was great talking about 1984. I hope everybody enjoyed listening to it. I hope some people out there that maybe haven't heard it will now be, kind of spurred on to go pick it up and listen to it, because, like we're saying, it's a soundtrack album, but it doesn't play like that. It plays more like a Eurythmics album, and it's just a classic album in their canon. I think it's one of their finest albums, and then they believe that as well. So
yeah, we'll have to have a podcast with and get fans on at some point to kind of talk about this, because I think fans could talk about this for a really long time, because it's special to a lot of people.
Wouldn't it be great to hear like different fans' perspectives on things? Like my whole thing about Winston's Diary sounding Western. I would love to hear what other fans would think along those lines of other songs or anything that comes in their head. And
yeah,
very interesting.
If you want to get the 12-inch extended version of Sex Crime, it was just put on one of those Now That's What I Call Music 4 CD compilations, and those are generally they're remastered and all that. It sounds really good. It's the second track on one called Now That's What I Call 12-inch 80s Extended. But again, you see kind of a revival with this. This just came out a few months ago. The music from 1984 is still, being released in different ways. So it's exciting about that.
It is, yes.
Well, it's good to talk to you again. Good podcast.
Likewise. We always have great conversations. That's why we decided to record them and share them with the world.
we can talk about 1984 for a long time, but we probably need to, we'll have a second part or way down the road or sometime. Like I said.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And
what most important, if you haven't voted for Eurythmics for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that you can do daily, you must do that. Have you done that yet today, Brex?
I do it every morning, first thing as I'm having my coffee.
Yeah, I do too.
Yes.
All right.
So yeah, just go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame website to the fan vote, and you can vote there daily until April 29th. All right.
All right. Sounds good.
Okay, thanks, everyone. Bye, Mark.
Bye.